So today it's a pleasure to welcome Paul Copan to come and speak to us. Paul is a Christian philosopher, theologian, apologist, and author. He has a PhD in philosophy and currently holds the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics in Palm Beach, Atlantic University in Florida. We were tipped off that he's across in this country for a few months on sabbatical, and we're very grateful for him giving up some time during that sabbatical study time to come to talk to us. He's written a number of books, academic articles, a large number of academic articles, some popular books, some of which are on the bookstore. If you want to head for the few copies we've got, they're immediately on the left-hand end of the bookstore as you go out of here, to give you a flavour of some of the popular books. When God Goes to Starbucks, How Do You Know You're Not Wrong, and a little book for new philosophers. So do look in on the bookstore afterwards and browse through some of Paul's books. So it's a pleasure, Paul, to welcome you here to the Faraday Institute today to give today's seminar on the scientific naturalists are declaring the glory of God, theistic support from unlikely places.
Very good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in these wonderful lectures. I've seen some of the Faraday lectures online, and it's a privilege to be part of that ongoing series. I am going to be speaking on a topic that may seem a little unusual, but as we unpack it, I think you'll appreciate a little bit more where I'm coming from. And this is an overview of where we're going to be going on our talk. I wanted to talk about the appeal of theism, people who have come out of a skeptical viewpoint and have embraced theism. What are some of the reasons? And then we'll look at the tenets of theism and naturalism. And then we'll look at the brief overview of the metaphysical context for naturalism and theism. And then the assistance of naturalists who actually help to reinforce the greater plausibility of theism. So we will look at our first point, the appeal of theism. And why have certain people abandoned, what have been some of the reasons that people have abandoned theism, naturalism to embrace theism? Well, here's an example. Antony Flew, who had taught at Reading, and he said he wanted to follow the evidence wherever it leads, and in light of recent scientific discoveries, he came to change his mind. The beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the complexity of biological life. These were the main reasons that he embraced belief in God, although more of a deistic sort. But he was convinced, having been an atheist for much of his career as a philosopher, he changed his mind. G.K. Chesterton talks about this in his book Orthodoxy, The Ethics of Elfland, one of his chapters, where he says that he could not believe the rationalists and materialists, that they didn't go deeply enough into understanding who we are as human beings. And so he said, the only words that ever satisfied me as describing nature are the terms used in the fairy books: charm, spell, enchantment. Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. That he found that in his direction, the Christian faith, that made a lot more sense of the world than what he could detect in the materialists and the naturalists that he had been reading. And this is why he described in the Daily News why he returned, and others along with him, to the Christian faith. That he said, we have returned to it because it is an intelligible picture of the world. Numbers of us have returned to this belief, and we have returned to it not because of this argument or that argument, but because of the theory that when it is adopted, works out everywhere, because the coat, when it is tried on, fits in every crease. We put on the theory like a magic hat, and history becomes translucent, like a house of glass. C.S. Lewis, familiar with him, he came to have this sort of view, influenced by Chesterton and others, but he says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, I think this is critical, but because by it I see everything else. That greater illumination that the Christian faith brought to his own thinking. Francis Collins, you're no doubt familiar with him. And as he started to think about the evidence for God, against God, and so forth, he says, I had never really considered the evidence for and against belief. Did I not consider myself a scientist? Does a scientist draw conclusions without considering the data? Could there be a more important question than in all of human existence than, is there a God? And yet there I found myself with a combination of willful blindness and something that could only be properly described as arrogance, having avoided any serious consideration that God might be a real possibility. Suddenly, all my arguments seemed very thin, and I had the sensation that the ice under my feet was cracking. And he thought, as he looked at his own arguments, that they were more like that of a young schoolboy, rather than having any sophistication to them. And just in case, so I'm not speaking in a sense, preaching with the choir here, that there are notable naturalists who have acknowledged the intellectual competency of theistic thinkers. Quentin Smith, he talks about the upsurge of philosophy of religion in the latter part of the 20th century, and he says that realist theists, people like Albert Plantinga he had in mind, and others, were not outmatched by naturalists in terms of the most valued standards of analytic philosophy: conceptual precision, rigor of argumentation, technical erudition, and an in-depth defense of an original worldview. Thomas Nagel, an atheist at New York University, professor emeritus of philosophy there and law, said some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. And something that troubled him because he doesn't want there to be a God. He said, I don't want there to be a universe like that. And so he said he was troubled by this fact that some of the intelligent and well-informed people are religious believers. But that's a bit of a backdrop, and we'll come back to this a little bit later on. But I wanted to briefly talk about the tenets of these two competing worldviews, naturalism and theism. We'll begin with theism and defining what we mean by that. First, that there is this personal, intrinsically good, immensely powerful and intelligent being that creates a world distinct from God, and also, second crucial part, creating human beings with the divine image, that there is something significant to human beings that is not part of other species in the animal kingdom. So the universe and human beings have a personal source, that there is an intelligence behind, a person behind the universe and those human beings. That human dignity and objective values exist, and that they're not simply the product of valueless material processes, but they're an endowment by an intrinsically good being. And also that the universe came to existence a finite time ago, that it is not eternal. And as Genesis 1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that there is a powerful source independent of the universe that brought it into existence. And then the universe is bio-friendly, that is not only life-permitting, but is also life-producing and life-sustaining. Those are three distinctions that are important to make. Just because you have a life-permitting universe isn't a guarantee that life is going to be produced, and even beyond that, that it's going to be sustained. Let me briefly move into naturalism. You may be familiar with the Cosmos series that Carl Sagan did, the astronomer from Cornell University. And he, in his book and in his movies or video series, said that the cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be. There is no reality outside of this. This is the metaphysical position of the naturalist. But that's kind of in a nutshell form what naturalism is, but let's unpack that a little bit further. There are three basic features that we could, if we wanted to synthesize the literature into these three components. If you think of a three-legged stool, I think these would be the ones that would be highlighted. First has to do with reality or metaphysics. That matter is all that exists, or we could call this materialism. And we'll see a quotation shortly on this. But when it comes to etiology or causes or causation, that the predominant view is that all events are physically determined by prior physical events. We could talk about quantum physics if you like. But this is largely where the literature points, that this kind of determinism of events going all the way back to the Big Bang. That you can predict, in principle, everything that is going to take place based on those preceding events. And then finally, when it comes to knowledge or epistemology, that knowledge is the only way that we can come to know things. And that's the stronger version. There's a weaker version. That knowledge is best acquired through the scientific method. So that we could call that scientism. So materialism, determinism, scientism. But let's expand on this a little bit because there are varieties of naturalism. And but I suppose I should mention this. Let me just give a few sample quotations here. Kai Nielsen, atheist, naturalist, emeritus philosopher at the University of Calgary. Naturalism denies that there are any spiritual or supernatural reality. It is the view that anything that exists is ultimately composed of physical components. As to determinism, this is from the website naturalism.org, and Daniel Dennett and other notables are on the board of naturalism.org. From a naturalistic perspective, we do not have what many people think of as free will, being able to cause our behavior without our being fully caused in turn. So free will, moral responsibility, those are challenged by naturalism at its core. And then scientism. David Armstrong, what does modern science have to say about the nature of man? And notice how he unpacks this. I'm not going to go through the whole quotation, I'm just giving you a few snippets here. But he goes on to say, for me then, and for many philosophers who think like me, the moral is clear. We must try and work out an account of the nature of mind which is compatible with the view that man is nothing but a physico-chemical mechanism. So there we have those three components and a few sample quotations. But again, we can also talk about varieties of naturalism. There's kind of a crude or naive naturalism versus a more nuanced naturalism. You may be familiar with the new atheists, who are a bit more like the, often when they're arguing against belief in God, they tend to be more like village atheists than sophisticated scholars. We have some of these books, these best-selling books, and when you read some of them, in fact, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, one naturalist by the name of Michael Roos said, Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, makes me embarrassed to be an atheist. So that is the kind of caliber that you sometimes see in these popular level books. So that's the crude versus the more sophisticated version. There's also a strict naturalism versus what we could call a broad naturalism. The strict naturalism would be more reductionistic or physicalistic or restrictive. And Dawkins, for example, in his book River Out of Eden, says that in a world of selfish genes and electrons, there is no good or evil, that there's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, and that we're simply dancing to the music of our DNA. Paul and Patricia Churchland talk about consciousness in terms of folk psychology. It's kind of the commonly believed view, what the people commonly hold, but we can't really talk about this consciousness or this inner life that we have. It could all be explained in this sort of reductionistic, physicalistic manner. And Patricia Churchland talks about the 4 F's that human beings are interested in, like other species, fighting, feeding, fleeing, and reproducing. And she says that truth takes the hindmost. That we're interested in survival as a species, not in the pursuit of truth. So that's the stricter version. Then there's the broad or popular naturalism, which is non-reductive, more commonsensical, kind of the things that G.K. Chesterton was aiming at, that allows for emergent properties, values, consciousness, subjective experience, what are called qualia, that inner feel that you have. You know what it's like to be you. And what Thomas Nagel wrote about, what is it like to be a bat? There's that own inner field that something has that can't be scientifically described in the third person. These properties emerge when physical properties are sufficiently complex, say the brain and nervous system. And this emergence results in the being, thinking, and acting of conscious subjects that have emotions, desires, and so forth. But what all of these versions do have in common would be that they are anti-supernatural, that there is no God, no gods, no angels, no miracles, no afterlife, no substantial soul that can exist after bodily death. So that's a brief overview of both theism and naturalism in its varieties. And I would say that 2, I think, well-recognized, well-spoken representatives of naturalism would be Jaegwon Kim of Brown University and also John Searle at the University of California at Berkeley. They're not reductionists. They do hold to this emergent property view that, like the mental emerging or supervening on the physical, when you have this complexity of nervous system and brain that give rise to, say, consciousness and so forth. But they acknowledge, nevertheless, the radical implications of naturalism, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But I would say that these properties that we talk about, these emergent properties, are really better placed within a theistic worldview rather than a naturalistic worldview. And that I'm going to, as I go through my talk, incorporate statements made that include both the strict and the broad naturalists, because I think that ultimately it will reduce to the same sort of thing: the determinism, the scientism, as well as the metaphysical materialism. So let's take a look at a couple of quotations here. Naturalism, Jae-Won Kim says, is imperialistic. It demands full coverage and exacts a terribly high ontological price. When we're talking about ontological, we're talking about what is really, what really exists. Another sometimes interchangeable with metaphysics. That when you look at the radical implications of the metaphysical view of naturalism, it is very drastic, and that's what he is highlighting here. John Searle, he says there is exactly one overriding question in contemporary philosophy: how do we fit in? How can we square this self-conception of ourselves as mindful, meaning-creating, or maybe meaning-perceiving, free, rational, etc. agents without a universe that consists entirely of mindless, meaningless, unfree, non-rational, brute, physical particles? And I think this question is a perfect lead-in to where we want to go in terms of understanding the context of theism and naturalism. Which context offers us a better fit? Which context leads more naturally to the phenomena that we're going to consider? So what I'd like to do is look at 3 criteria that are worth considering. There are others, but I think these are important for us to consider, and I think get to the heart of the matter, and then relevant categories to consider beyond those criteria. So let's unpack the criteria to consider when comparing these two metaphysical contexts. Could apply to others, but we're just looking at theism and naturalism. The first has to do with a natural fit. Which seems to fit best with the background? When it comes to the background and the phenomenon in question, is there a natural transition, a natural, more seamless garment, if you will? Which is the view that is least disjointed from the phenomenon in question? Given theism or naturalism, which features of the universe and human experience are the more likely to emerge? The atheist philosopher, and he's also a moral realist, so he would be the broader naturalist, Eric Wielenberg, says, from valuelessness, value sometimes comes. He's actually writing a response to me when I said from value, value comes. And he was saying, well, no, sometimes value can come out of valuelessness, like valueless material processes. But how do you move from those mindless, valueless material processes to objective moral values? Eric Wielenberg believes that there are these moral facts that are like these Platonic forms that already exist, and then somehow human beings develop through the evolutionary process to the point that they actually they're these morally valuable beings, have duties that correspond to those moral facts that seem to have been anticipating their arrival on the scene. Again, this is very jarring and very disjointed. What is a smoother transition is something like human beings being made in the image of God, where there is no somehow this cosmic surprise at the end, where those facts seem to just have been waiting for you to pay attention to. So intrinsic human value and moral duties come to us as a surprise given naturalism, but with theism, and again I'd say it holds from value, value comes, that the more likely scenario is that we have been made in the image of a supremely valuable being, that is where human dignity comes from. So that's the first criterion. The second one has to do with the unification. Which does a better job of bringing all these disparate pieces together? Which theory seems to make the best sense out of all of these, brings coherence to these various considerations from the Big Bang to the fine-tuning of the universe to consciousness and rationality and so forth. Which brings all these disparate pieces together? Is it something like naturalism? Or is there some sort of a grand unified theory, in a sense, that theism offers to bring all of these things into a coherent whole? Del Ratch, a philosopher of religion, philosopher of science, says when a value is produced by a long, tricky, precarious process, when it is generated and preserved by some breathtaking complexity, when it is realized against all odds, then intent, even design, suddenly becomes alive and reasonable question. So that's the unification criterion, which brings it all together. And then the basicality criterion, which worldview actually brings us more deeply into the metaphysical grounding. Here's a quotation from the BBC debate that Bertrand Russell had with theist philosopher of religion Frederick Copleston. And Copleston asked Bertrand Russell, how did the universe get here? And Russell said, I should say that the universe is just there. And that's all. Didn't want to give any deeper account than that. Like, where did it come from? How did it arrive? How do you get from matter, energy, space, and time from nothing? Well, again, theism seems to fit the bill here. It brings us to a deeper metaphysical level to account for the emergence of the universe, rather than simply talking about brute facts, or that's just the way it is. So those are the three criteria that I wanted to highlight. And so we'll move into, I know I have 90 slides here or so I need to move with unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, and majestic instancy in order to get through all of this, but I think we're making reasonable time here. But so let's look at the categories when assessing the metaphysical context. First, let's look at the notion of consciousness, or the feature of consciousness, self-consciousness, that this exists, that we are aware of our own awareness even. Theism, there is a supremely self-aware being. Whereas naturalism, again, if you do hold to consciousness, if you're a broader naturalist, that consciousness emerged from mindless, non-conscious material processes. Free will or moral responsibility. Again, we take moral responsibility for granted in our culture. Again, it's very widespread. We don't say, Your Honor, my genes made me do it. We take responsibility for our actions. Well, what accounts for that? That our actions are up to us. We make free personal decisions, at least some of the time, and so that we are generally accountable for actions. Well, there is a free being that chooses to create. That's one metaphysical backdrop. Another one is that the universe and all it contains has emerged from mindless material processes. Rationality. We trust our senses and rational faculties as generally reliable in producing beliefs. We take our beliefs seriously. We don't believe that our minds are systematically deceiving us. We claim that this is true, and even when we disagree with someone, we take our view to be true, and that the other person with whom we're disagreeing to be in error. Theism. A rational mind exists independent of the universe, as opposed to naturalism, where beliefs are produced by non-rational material processes, neurons and hormones. If beliefs are true, then it would be by accident. In fact, I asked Richard Dawkins this question in an open forum. I said, if we're simply the products of these blind, non-rational material forces, why do you think that the naturalist is more rational than the theist if both of them believe what they do according to forces over which they have no control? And he just kind of whipped off this line, well, science flies rockets to the moon, but religion flies planes into buildings. That was his final response. But of course, those terrorists were simply dancing to the music of their DNA. They couldn't help it. So he just bypassed the question. I like to say that he was Dawkins the issue. But the origin of the universe. The universe began to exist a finite time ago, without previously existing energy, space, or time. And this, through the Big Bang, second law of thermodynamics, the microwave background radiation of the universe, and so forth, these indicate that past time is finite. Theism, an immensely powerful being caused the universe to be, that something comes from something rather than, that being comes from being rather than non-being, as the naturalist is going to be forced to admit. Or you can say that some people will say the universe is self-caused, people like Clinton Smith. maintained that view. By the biofriendliness of the universe is finely tuned for intelligent life, what has been called the Goldilocks effect. It's not too hot, not too cold, but just right for life. Theism maintains that a wise, intelligent being exists, as opposed to naturalism, where things just happened to be right. Given enough time, or maybe possible worlds, a finely tuned world would eventually emerge. Now, the problem with, let me just maybe, well, I'll come back to that in a moment, but let me just say a little bit here. I'll come back to that question of fine-tuning, but I'll just, guys, wrap up with the list here. Human value. Humans are persons who have intrinsic dignity and worth, and theism maintains that a supremely valuable personal being exists. Naturalism, that any value that exists would be the result of valueless material processes, kind of like Eric Wielenberg maintained. Then we come to beauty. Beauty exists in the universe, and we appropriate beautiful or elegant explanations in science, such as Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism. Theism, that there is a creative, intelligent being that exists. Naturalism. Beauty somehow emerged, again, if you will even acknowledge that beauty does exist, objective beauty, from non-rational, mindless, physical processes. And again, here, I would maintain that theism makes a lot more sense than a naturalistic backdrop for this. That consciousness, beauty, free will, personhood, again, some people are reductionistic because it's kind of the broader version of naturalism. That, not to mention the beginning of the fine-tuning of the universe, is hardly surprising if a good, personal, rational, creative, powerful, and wise God exists. But again, these sorts of things are startling, shocking, unexpected if these are the products of these blind, deterministic, non-conscious, non-rational material processes. Alvin Plantinga, I think, is right when he says that theism offers answers or suggestions for answers to a wide range of otherwise intractable questions. Well, here we come to quoting a lot of naturalists. The Beatles, you may remember from their Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, have a song, I Get By With a Little Help from My Friends. We'll keep it there. They do go on to say, I get high with a little help from my friends. But what I want to do is talk about how naturalists actually help to reinforce theism and the explanatory power that it has. So let's unpack this and take note of the quotations that we'll be using, well, again, quoting all naturalists unless otherwise noted. That these naturalists, as they articulate their own views, they will often honestly express the seeming inconsistency between naturalism and the phenomenon in question. Or there's utter astonishment at the phenomenon in question, or they will, they will even borrow language and metaphysical furniture from a theistic universe without acknowledging theism's more suitable setting. Again, kind of taking these as brute facts, if you will. So as we look at this, again, there's the scripture portion, Psalm 19:1, that says the heavens are declaring the glory of God, and their expanse is showing the work of His hands. Well, these scientific naturalists, I would argue, are also declaring the glory of God in an indirect and unintentional way. First of all, when it comes to the existence of the universe, Ludwig Wittgenstein, he talked about the amazement that he experienced at the very nature of existence. He says, I wonder at the existence of the world. He said, how extraordinary that anything should exist, how extraordinary that the world should exist. He was so amazed by this. Why does anything exist at all? John Barrow and Joseph Silk, astrophysicists who talk about the traditional picture of the origin of the universe looks like creation out of nothing. That this is, they said, what preceded the event called the Big Bang? The answer to our question is simple. Nothing. I'd say, well, actually, that doesn't really make a whole lot of metaphysical sense, that being can come out of non-being. I'd say that actually plays into the theist's explanation far more suitably. Michael Turner, that there once was no previous era, and that matter, energy, space, and time began abruptly with a bang. Again, being from being or being from non-being. William Rowe, atheist philosopher, naturalist, died recently. It must be acknowledged that the emergence of the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe has given new weight to an argument for the existence of some sort of creator. We move to consciousness. Jeffrey Maddow, who says, the emergence of consciousness then is a mystery, and one to which materialism signally fails to provide an answer. David Papineau, to this question of consciousness's origins, physicalists' theories of consciousness seem to provide no answer. There is this drumbeat of a theme in the literature. John Searle, the leading problem of the biological science is the problem of explaining how neurobiological processes cause conscious experiences. Colin McGinn, we know how planets are formed and so forth, but we don't know how, how consciousness could emerge. It seems like a radical novelty in the universe, not prefigured by the after effects of the Big Bang. So how did it contrive to spring into being from what preceded it? Again, baffling. There is no naturalistic accounting for this. Jaegwon Kim, he talks about this mystery in our seeming inability to understand the phenomenon of consciousness as part of a world that is essentially physical, and what is worse, not knowing just what it is that we need to know if we are to achieve such an understanding. How could a series of physical events, little particles jostling against one another, electric current rushing to and fro, blossom into a conscious experience? Again, he says, that there has just been, the project is to find a way, recently in philosophy of mind, of accommodating the mental within the principled physicalist scheme, while at the same time preserving, notice the desire to preserve some of these common sense things that we take for granted, that, without losing what we value or find special in our nature as creatures with minds. What about free will and moral responsibility? Thomas Nagel says there is no room for agency in a world of neural impulses and chemical reactions and so forth. William Provine died in 2015. At Cornell University said free will as traditionally conceived simply does not exist. There's no way the evolutionary process as currently conceived can produce a being that is truly free to make choices. And I would say unless you bring a free creator into the picture who helps to make sense and offer a context for that. John Searle, he says, we believe we could have done something else, that human freedom is just a fact of experience, but because of his commitment to the scientific, or I'd say scientistic, worldview, he rejects libertarian freedom because this would somehow interfere with the causal order of nature. Richard Dawkins, again, I've given that quotation, DNA just is and we just dance to its music. Rationality. There's E.O. Wilson, the Lord of the Ants. He's an entomologist. As Freud once remarked, Copernicus demonstrated that the Earth is not at the center of the universe, Darwin, that we are not the center of life, and he, Freud, that we are not even in control of our own minds. Noam Chomsky, since it is just blind luck of the human science-forming capacity, a particular component of the human biological endowment happens to yield a result that conforms more or less to the truth about the world. It is largely a lucky accident that there is such a partial convergence, that we somehow get truth. That's just lucky. Richard Rorty, every speech, thought, theory, poem, composition, and philosophy will turn out to be completely predictable in purely naturalistic terms. The prediction of every sound or inscription which will ever be uttered, including, no doubt, his book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, that too is the result of those physical processes. And again, he says the idea that one species of organism, unlike all the others, oriented not just toward its own uncreated prosperity, but toward truth, is as un-Darwinian as he goes on to talk about his conscience as well. So being truth seekers is utterly un-Darwinian, he says. Objective moral values. Joel Marx had been a moral realist for a long time as an atheist, but he says, I've given up morality altogether. In a word, this philosopher has been long laboring under the unexamined assumption, namely that there is such a thing as right and wrong. I now believe there isn't. Atheism implies amorality. Without God, there is no morality. Kai Nielsen, noted atheist philosopher, we have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. The point is this: pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. Alex Rosenberg, philosopher at Duke, it seems to me that as most of those who fear Darwin's dangerous idea, shades of Daniel Dennett here, that its universal solvent is in fact an acid eating through every available argument from the values people cherish, said, I do not think we can hide our countenances from the nihilism, the meaninglessness that this worldview underwrites. So he's just coming face to face with what he sees as the implications of naturalism. J.L. Mackie, he says more positively that if there are moral properties, then these would constitute an argument for an all-powerful God. I'd say maybe all-good God, more suitably. Evidence of design in nature, the fine-tuning of the universe. If these conditions were altered by only modest amounts, the universe would be qualitatively different. And life would become impossible. We see these sorts of things. The universe and its laws appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us, and, if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. Sir Roger Penrose talks about what it would take to have, in terms of mathematical probability, what it would take to have a life-permitting universe. And again, this isn't a guarantee that life is going to be produced even. But it's 1 in 10 times 10 to the 123rd power. An extraordinary figure. Basically, that's a number greater than all of the subatomic particles in the universe. I just had a conversation this weekend. My wife and I actually were talking with a couple, and they're saying, well, there's no problem here. If the universe were life prohibiting, then we wouldn't be here talking about it. And so you'll have sometimes that kind of an argument. We shouldn't be surprised. Because we wouldn't even be here in order to experience surprise. Well, is that a good response? Well, I think there is something to be said. Sure, if we exist, well, obviously the universe does have life-permitting and life-producing properties. But it doesn't logically follow that we shouldn't be surprised that we do witness conditions to the universe that are compatible with our existence. So John Leslie, for example, uses this example, and I'll go to the bottom here. He talks about this firing squad. What if there's a firing squad in front of you, 50 crack sharpshooters who have their rifles aimed at your heart. You hear this big roar. And then you look, you're still alive. All of them missed your heart. What could be the explanation for that? You don't say, well, if they had missed, if they hadn't missed, then I wouldn't be here asking this sort of question, or I wouldn't be thinking about this. But surely there's more to probe than that sort of a scenario. Was it by deliberate design? Why did they all miss? There is no inconsistency in not being surprised that you do not observe that you are dead, and being surprised to observe that you are still alive. And we can ask the question. Well, here you have an exception here in this cartoon. This one explanation. These other sharpshooters are blindfolded. To make it more sporting, I've also blindfolded the men who are about to execute this person here in the cartoon. So that might be one reason to expect that they didn't, or to explain why they didn't kill you. But I think the more response would be that there was this your being alive is the result of a purposeful plan. Some people say, no, this is just like looking at the lottery. Your chance is just as good as any of winning. But let's actually specify that. I think something that cuts to the chase a bit more clearly is, what if I'm given one chance to pick out one life-permitting ball out of the trillion times over life-prohibiting balls? If I'm blindfolded, pick out the exact one. Chances are you would think that it was rigged, that I know the person who owns the lottery or something like that. That there's something highly suspect here if I have that one chance and I just happen to get it right. People don't accept such dismissive explanations in other areas of life. If I'm a car dealer and I get royal flushes hand after hand, you're going to start to suspect that something's fishy. We're left also with the problem, again, even apart from the fine-tuning, the universe still began to exist a finite time ago. And how do we account for the initial conditions that allow for human life? And also, some people say, well, look, there could be multiple worlds. But again, we don't even have any sort of explanation for where those worlds came from, that there are those worlds that exist at all. And even so, those worlds would be finite. They still had a beginning a finite time ago. So again, and it said the dismissal of the fine-tuning argument in the universe, I think, runs counter to our intuitions. Basically, what we're left with is a scenario in which there is, no matter how complex the universe, no matter how finely tuned it is, no matter how much of a razor's edge it is to have everything so delicately balanced, according to the logic that I'm just responding to, there could never be a finely tuned universe so complex that it would give rise to belief in some sort of a designer. That's problematic, I would say. There's also a certain teleological tendency in biological organisms. Richard Dawkins talks about the machine code of the genes, uncannily computer-like, like a computer engineering journal. Francis Crick says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather involved, as though you have to pick between the two. Again, he says, an honest man armed with all the knowledge he would have to state in some sense that the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions to which that have to be satisfied to get it going. Every living cell, and even the simplest bacterium, teems with molecular contraptions that would be the envy of any nanotechnologist. Bruce Alberts says that, like machines invented by humans to deal efficiently with the macroscopic world, these protein assemblies contain highly coordinated moving parts. Timothy Lenoir, again, he's an atheist. He's not keen on design at all. But he says, he says teleological or design or purposive thinking has been steadily resisted by modern biology, and yet in nearly every area of research, biologists are hard-pressed to find language that does not impute purposiveness to living forms. Very interesting. Again, these are just naturalists. It's sort of like, just let them speak and draw your own conclusions. And it's interesting, too, even Richard Dawkins has a certain implicit belief in teleology. Dawkins says that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And those who squander their intellectual capital, like Kurt Wise, who got a Harvard PhD in paleontology, who tossed away his potentially prestigious career to become, as he put it, an intellectually unfulfilled young earth creationist. Well, it sounds like he has teleology in mind, that there's a certain goal that you ought to pursue, that you ought to be responsible in carrying out that potential and fulfilling that potential. What about beauty in the universe? And I could go on and talk about aesthetic experience, but here's this atheist philosopher who says in experience beauty, we feel ourselves to be in contact with a deeper reality than the everyday. Very interesting. Atheist philosopher Roger Scruton says in the sentiment of beauty, we feel the purposiveness and intelligibility of everything that surrounds us. Stephen Weinberg, sometimes nature seems to be more beautiful than strictly necessary. We talk about human uniqueness too. E.O. Wilson, Richard Dawkins talk about how we alone can rebel against the tyranny of selfish replicators. Terence Deacon talks about how humans know what it's like to see evolution happening, what it feels like. Daniel Dennett says we have creeds as human beings and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. This fact makes us different. So again, we see that the naturalists seem to be declaring the glory of God here. A lot of the things that theists can readily appeal to, talk about, say this fits within a theistic worldview, a lot of these sorts of statements do suggest that theism offers us a more plausible context to explain these sorts of things. Let's revisit a quotation of John Searle, and we need to wrap up here shortly. That this, how do we fit into this world? How can we square the self-conception of ourselves as mindful, meaning-creating or meaning-discovering, free, rational agents in the midst of this, basically, world of brute physical particles? John Searle even admits physical events can only have physical explanations, and consciousness is not physical, so consciousness plays no explanatory role whatsoever. If, for example, you think you ate because you were consciously hungry, or got married because you're consciously in love with your prospective spouse, or you drew your hand from the flame because you consciously felt a pain, or spoke up at a meeting because you consciously disagreed with the main speaker, you are mistaken in every case. In each case, the effect was a physical event, and therefore must have an entirely physical explanation. And we could throw his own statement in there, that his own statement is grounded in a merely physical process. So if he's right, it's merely by accident, rather than by virtue of rationality. You see, naturalism is going to at times have to borrow from a purposive, humanizing worldview like theism in order to make room for certain inescapable features of life. And even these quotations by Dawkins, science can't tell us about right and wrong. Or he even admits that in the academy, he's a passionate Darwinian, but when it comes to social policy, politics, how we should conduct our human affairs, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian. You see, as a theist, you don't have to pit one against the other. Your theory and your practice can very nicely fit together. Also, naturalism appears to leave us with a counterintuitively humanity-negating conclusion, an incomplete picture of who we really are. And that's precisely the appeal that was made by Chesterton and others, that those things that humanize us, morality, moral responsibility, human dignity and worth, free will, beauty, and so forth, all of these things fit so beautifully within a theistic worldview, and that materialistic, naturalistic explanations simply fail to account for how those sorts of things could be accounted for in this world. So that's, I should probably stop here. We're at quarter till. But that's I have a few more slides, but that's the gist of what I wanted to say about how the naturalists are indeed declaring the glory of God. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you too for leaving plenty of time for questions and keeping to time. Who would like to be first off? Here we are.
Thanks very much. You've not really made a distinction between metaphysical naturalism and methodological naturalism. If you really emphasize the metaphysical sides of this in quoting various people who attribute value to, their perception of the beginnings of the universe, I wonder, would you agree that methodological naturalism, which really is a reflection of the nature of a question, how does something work? I would submit to you that that's really how science works in general. Would you agree that that's a good thing, to investigate natural phenomena based on the question, how does it work? So if you ask me, how does this watch work, I don't respond to you by saying Rolex. Rather, I look for a battery or a coiled spring. But we could argue about whether there's, without having to deny some sort of supernatural role,
Right.
The search for a natural mechanism, I would submit to you, is actually a fundamental aspect of science itself.
Yeah, I think that there is a proper distinction to be made between metaphysical naturalism and methodological naturalism. How do things actually work in the world? And there are plenty of Christian philosophers of science and so forth, scientists who would maintain a methodological naturalism. So that is, in a sense, a topic that we could bracket. But I would also say that I think they're at the margins. Generally, I would agree, but I think at the margins there are some things that are going to be difficult to account for. So, for example, our son in India, when he was with a team from Palm Beach Atlantic University, where I teach, and there was a man who had cerebral palsy, and he was brought to this group of students, my students, from Palm Beach Atlantic University. They prayed for him in the name of Jesus, and they put their hands on him. And Ben Greco, who's had been a student of mine, who still lives in West Palm Beach, you can contact him. But he said that he was praying for this man. He could feel the bones in this young man's back moving into place, so that by the time that they were done praying with this man who had never been able to walk before, he was literally walking and leaping like something right out of the Bible. Now, we can talk about how, well, maybe the process was sped up with that miracle or something. Well, I would say that something that cannot simply be accounted for by natural processes would, like a divine agent acting in the world, and again, if there is a divine agent who brought the universe to being, we can also talk about an agent who also acts in the world. So simply because something physical happens doesn't require that I have to therefore find a physical explanation for it. There is certainly room for, in an open universe rather than a closed one, for this agent to act in the world. So that's what I'd say. Roughly speaking, a good distinction, but when we get to the margins, I think there are some places where we can, in a sense, distance ourselves from that.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor. The problem of qualia. As I understand it, emergent properties and epigenetic features in a sufficiently complex organisation are able to produce exactly the kind of quantum leap and paradigm shifts that give us the nub of your problem. In other words, epigenetic features or supreme qualia are not predictable by the very laws which do produce them lawfully and meaningfully.
Right.
And particularly if you then include top-down causation, which you may or may not include, but what I'm trying to suggest is maybe there is an argument there which would produce some of those things, given an organisation of sufficient complexity. And the brain, again, as far as I understand it, does have the kind of complexity. It does have a number of logical connections greater than the number of atoms in the universe, to quote your message. Given that, I mean, that is of such staggering complexity, couldn't a naturalist argue that it is capable of producing, in some way which we are totally unable to account for, the kind of paradigm shifts and quantum leaps with which we're struggling?
Yeah, no, excellent question. I would say just a couple of things. Broadly speaking, all of these sorts of qualia, these properties that we associate with, that inner feel that we have about this or that, that kind of inner experience, that subjective experience, I would say, metaphysically speaking, makes sense if there is a personal source that, whether it's direct, you can talk about direct creation, some people do, or indirect creation, that the context is still there, metaphysically speaking, from a theistic source as opposed to a naturalistic one, that you have already, in a sense, the metaphysical capital available from the theist from the theistic worldview that would allow for that to actually emerge. As I quoted all of these philosophers of mind, Searle and Kim and others, this is a huge problem within the area of the philosophy of mind, that they simply can't account for it. And so that's one point. I would say, secondly, it also banks on the capital of a theistic worldview that one gives rise to a universe that began to exist a finite time ago. Secondly, that this universe is remarkably finely tuned for life and for the emergence of these properties. And that these qualities, and it's also a life-sustaining and consciousness-sustaining kind of universe. So you have, in a sense, a number of things that that need to be in place in order for those qualia to actually emerge. But it's not as though you can say, well, thanks very much, theism, for the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the emergence of life, and so forth. We'll take it from here. I'd say you've got to take the entire package and not simply say, well, no, it can all be self-explanatory. No, if you've already got the universe that began to exist, that is finely tuned and so forth, you in a sense already have the equipment there, theistically speaking, that can also further explain these sorts of things that are considered great conundrums or difficulties for naturalistic philosophers of mind.
Is there a danger in that when you say that people can't explain, of actually almost having a God of the gaps type of approach that who knows, 50, 100, 200 years down the line, we have physical explanations?
Yeah. Well, that was PowerPoint number 100 something or other, the slide that I wasn't able to get to. But I would say that, yeah, there is that possibility of the God of the gaps. But as I said before, in the 20th century, we can simply say what theists had maintained all along was that, one, the universe began to exist a finite time ago, that the universe was the product of an intelligent mind that made the conditions just right for intelligent life to exist. So it wasn't as though, where did the universe come from? Oh, let's say God did it. Theists were already holding that sort of a view. It wasn't as though they were trying to kind of get in on the action. It was something they maintained, and now they had, in the 20th century, the support for it. Secondly, I'd say there's also a danger of a kind of naturalism of the gaps. Basically, apart from any sort of considerations given to theism, there's always this default position that goes to naturalism. We call it a naturalism of the gaps. Science is going to somehow explain this. And I would simply say from a pragmatic or a kind of a practical point of view, well, let's just look at the worldview material that we have available to us. And even though we can't necessarily explain how something emerged, just the metaphysical capital that theism has as opposed to naturalism suggests that you have the resources in one that are very difficult to account for in the other. So even if you don't know how the entire process works, at least indirectly speaking, secondary causes and so forth, theism certainly has an appropriate place to play.
I wonder if it's strictly true to say that an evolved system cannot cannot interact with truth in the way that you say, because for a system to survive in evolution, it has to interact with the universe in such a way as to allow its existence to continue and to produce further copies. And if its senses didn't give some kind of true reflection of the universe it lived in, it would not survive. And therefore, to a certain extent, I would say that the capacity to see truth is partly a result, can be partly explained at least, as a result of an evolutionary process.
Okay, I would say that basically, if you can talk about, truth has been understood in basically three components. That there is truth, knowledge has to do with truth, that it's a belief that is true, but it is also a warranted true belief. You see, what Richard Dawkins was talking about was merely accidentally true belief. If I'm not ultimately responsible for the beliefs that I have, but they're due to physical processes over which I have no control, then if I'm dancing with my DNA, this becomes a problem. But I'd also say that when it comes to truth, there could be a lot of falsehoods that we believe that will enhance survival and reproduction. So, for example, if naturalism is true, and human beings don't fundamentally have this intrinsic dignity and worth, at least on the strict understanding of naturalism, then we could say, well, you can believe that human beings have dignity and worth, and this might enhance survival and reproduction. It might enhance the furthering of the species because we believe in that. But it may be completely false. And that's why Michael Ruse, for example, says that morality is a corporate illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. Dawkins, Ruse, and others speak about this illusion of design, the illusion of morality. It enhances survival and reproduction. And even though you believe that love your neighbor as yourself is as a moral duty that we have, they would simply say, well, this has simply been the result of an evolutionary process and an adaptation like our hands and feet and teeth and so forth, but it has no genuine objectivity apart from survival. And that's why Patricia Churchland talks about truth taking the hindmost. What it really matters is survival. Truth may assist in some places, but it would be, according to her, merely accidentally true belief rather than a warranted true belief.
Thank you. Any further questions? Everyone's hands up. One down the front here.
Thank you. What do you say to people who say that there is no reality in the word truth?
There's no reality in the word truth. I would ask them, do they believe that statement itself is true? They apparently take that statement itself to be true and corresponding to reality and so forth. But they would be engaging in what is sometimes called the self-accepting fallacy. They make themselves the exception to the rule that they proclaim to everyone else. So again, I would ultimately say that truth and also knowledge are inescapable. If we deny the truth, we'll actually be affirming the truth. We'll basically be saying that it's true, that there is no truth, or I know that you can't know, or something like that. So again, these are fundamental, we are wired for truth. We have been made in the image of God to be truth-seeking beings, rather than merely surviving organisms.
One last question just there.
Thank you very much. What do you think of Leconte de Nuit's view about how the next step of evolution will be in the moral and spiritual sphere?
Well, I think that there is, in some ways, something to that I think in many ways illustrated by what Lewis and Chesterton have admitted, that there is a kind of bankruptcy that has been, that they themselves experienced. That naturalism could not do a sufficient job of explaining the fullness of what we are as human beings, that it deprived us of our very humanity. And so, even some of these quotations by Anthony O'Keefe and Roger Scruton, though atheists, talking about beauty as moving us toward kind of this transcendent realm that they don't have any context for. I think that these are sorts of, in a sense, these are echoes or maybe prefigurings of that kind of pursuing of that impulse. I think there is something to that, a greater awakening, and I think some of the work that's been done in this area of recognizing that, that Roger Trigg, who's going to be coming here to speak, and Justin Baird have done in interviewing children worldwide, that there is what they have discovered to be an intuitive theism in young, 4- or 5-year-old minds, that they are, in a sense, wired for this, to believe that there is something beyond, and that it's often culture that kind of suppresses that natural, that intuitive theism that we come into the world with.
Thank you very much. I think we'll draw things to a close there. You've taken us on a fascinating tour, and I wish I could write faster to get your quotations down. It's been great listening to you. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much.